Earlier, I talked about the habitat, which is going to be all of the biotic and abiotic factors that make up where an organism lives. This is different. This is the niche. Niche is the full range of physical and biological conditions in which an organism lives, and then the key thing is the way in which the organism uses these resources. So this is going to be the range of temperatures that an organism needs to survive and its place in the food web. These are all part of its niche. What the organism eats, where it lives, where it's specifically where it beds down, or where it is going to spend most of its time. These are all part of the niche of that organism. If we're talking about different species of birds, it would be where in the tree they live, and where they get their food from. Those are all part of having a different niche. So it's also, like the habitat, it's a combination of biotic and abiotic factors in an ecosystem, often determine the number of different niches in the ecosystem. The more niches that you have in the ecosystem, the greater diversity of organisms you can have in that ecosystem. And the reason that is because no two species can share the same exact niche in the same habitat. It's just not possible. Different species need to eat different food. They need to live in different places. And the reason this is, are available to the different species that are there, then one species is going to make it, i.e., if not enough resources are available, then one of the species is going to make it, and one of the species is not going to make it, and that species is going to end up dying off. So different species they can occupy niches that are very similar, but they cannot occupy the same exact niche. So, for example, let's take a look at the deer and the elk in Kodiak, or not so much Kodiak, but on a Fognak. The elk and the deer have very similar niches. They eat very similar foods up on a Fognak. However, they have slightly different niches. They eat maybe a couple different things, different from each other, and that allows both those species to exist. If they had the same exact niche, what would happen is one of those species would end up surviving, and the other species would end up dying. So the interactions that the organisms have, organisms that live together in ecological communities interact constantly. And this happens all the time. Anywhere in a community, you're going to have a bunch of different organisms, and they're going to be interacting with each other. Some of these interactions, such as competition, which is just competing over any kind of resources, predation, and various forms of symbiosis can affect an ecosystem. Um, so what competition is? Organisms of the same or different species attempt to use an ecological resource in the same place at the same exact time. That's competition. So when you are the same species, like those two bears in the lower right hand corner, they're competing over maybe a mate, maybe some salmon, who knows? They're in a river right there. But they're competing over something, and they're competing over a resource. And a resource can be anything, but it's a necessity for life. So it could be water, especially in places that don't have a lot of water. You compete for that water. Nutrients, so anything that's going to be in food. Light, or not so much food too, we can talk about plants. Plants compete for nutrients, so it can get the nutrients that it needs in order to survive and live. Light is just competing for light, and that happens all the time with plants. Typically the plants that are going to be higher up are going to be the ones, when I say higher up, their leaves are higher than other plants. They're going to be the ones that get the light, and what's going to happen is they're going to end up excluding the plants that are beneath them, and they're going to die off because they can't get the light. We'll talk about that a little bit later on when we talk about succession. So food is another resource, space, and then mates is the last resource. So when you have this competition over these resources, it's going to result in a winner and a loser. The winner is going to survive, they're going to live a great life. However, the losing organism is going to fail to survive, and it's going to end up dying. And this is basically what the competitive exclusion principle is, and it states that no two species can occupy the same exact keyword, the same exact niche, in the same habitat at the same exact time. There's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser. And they kind of figured this out doing some lab experiments on a paramecium, and they had two different species of paramecium. You have Paramecium aurelia, and you have Paramecia caudatum. And if you grow them separately in a bacteria plate, They both do great in these paramecium. They eat the bacteria. On their y-axis here, we have our population, or sorry, number of organisms, and on the x-axis, we're going to have time. So the very first one right here, the paramecium numbers are very low. They are given lots of food, the right temperatures, they're getting all the things they need to survive, and their populations multiply, and they have much greater populations, and eventually they stable off. This happens to the other paramecium species, Paramecium caudatum. Again, it's on a plate that has a bunch of bacteria on it. It eats the bacteria, and then eventually their numbers rise, and then they kind of level off. However, if you place both of these paramecium together in the same exact area, and they're competing over the same exact resource, what's going to happen is one of the paramecium is going to end up surviving, and its numbers are going to grow, and the other paramecium, their numbers are going to decline, and eventually they're going to die off. This is basically the competitive exclusion principle. Like, let's take, say, for example, if we had the deer and the elk and Kodiak, and if they occupied the same exact niche, what would happen is either the deer or the elk would end up dying off, and the other would be successful. It's the competitive exclusion principle. Now, here's an example of the warbler here at the very bottom. Each of these species of warbler, notice they're different species. We have the Cape May warbler, the bay-breasted warbler, and the yellow-rumped warbler. They occupy different niches, and that allows them to all live in the same exact tree. So at the top here, the Cape May warbler feeds at the tips of the branches and near the tops of the tree, whereas the bay-breasted warbler, it feeds in the middle part of the tree. And then finally, our yellow-rumped warbler feeds in the lower part of the tree and at the bases of the middle branches. They feed and they live in different parts, and that allows them to survive there. So this allows these warblers to avoid direct competition because they feed in different part of the tree, and this is called resource partitioning. Now, back to talking about how different organisms interact. We're going to have a couple examples here. We're going to have a couple different vocab words, but one of them is predation, and a predation is just when one organism captures and feeds on another organism. And then the organism that is doing the killing and the capturing, that is going to be called the predator, and the prey is going to be the food. So if we were to look at bears and salmon, the bear is going to be the predator. It's the one that does the killing and the eating, and the prey in this case would be the food. You could also look at the human and the deer. The human, luckily, they have a gun, which makes it a lot easier. They can shoot a deer. The human is the predator, and the prey is going to be the deer. You could also look at the wolf on the mainland of Alaska. Oftentimes they will prey on deer, but also moose too. The wolf is going to be the predator, and the prey is going to be the moose, because that is the thing that is being eaten. Symbiosis is basically a whole other subset of community interactions in which two species live closely together. And there's three types of symbiotic relationships that can happen. The very first one is mutualism. Mutualism is when both species benefit from that relationship. So example is going to be here is the sea anemone, which are those white things that are going to be around that clownfish, Nemo, whatever you want to call it. What the sea anemones do is they provide the clownfish protection from predators, while the clownfish defend the anemones from the butterfly fish who like to eat the anemones. So they're both benefiting in this situation. Is a mutualistic interaction. Another one example would be flowers. Flowers and insects. The flowers, what they do is they provide nectar for the insects, so the insect's getting nectar, and the flower, it has help with reproduction because the insects and the birds and different things that are eating the nectar are spreading the pollen, and it helps out with reproduction. So it's a mutualism relationship, which is part of symbiosis, and both organisms in that relationship benefit. The next one is going to be commensalism, and in commensalism, one organism benefits, and the other organism that's involved in the relationship is not helped, but it's also not harmed either. So example would this be in this picture right here. You have the remora fish. The remora fish, they have stickers on their heads, and they attach to a shark. What's great for the remora is going to get some food, any kind of food scraps that shark is eating. Or not eating, but obviously not eating because they're food scraps, while the shark is not helped, but it's also not hurt at all either. So this is a commensalism interaction. Another example would be sometimes you see the orchid is a plant, and the orchid can grow in a tree. And an orchid is a flower, I should say. I don't have any pictures here, but it can grow in a tree. It can grow on the tree. And what it does is it kind of grows in the nooks and crannies of a tree. The orchid, what it does is it gets a place to live. It gets nutrients from the water that is coming through the tree. And it gets protection and all that great stuff. However, the tree that it's living in is not benefited and it's not harmed. It's a commensalism interaction. The final part of symbiosis is going to be parasitism. And this is where one organism lives on or inside another organism and harms it. If you look at this picture right here, we have the mosquito. The mosquito right there, it looks like a human flesh, but it's sucking out blood from that human. The parasite in this case is going to be the mosquito, and the host is what is providing that meal, and it's actually harming it. And it's harming it by taking blood, but also mosquitoes can also transmit viruses and stuff like that too. So they're not very good things. But anyways, the mosquito is benefiting, and the human in that case is not benefiting at all. Another example would be tapeworm. Tapeworm lives inside bodies of various mammals. The tapeworm is going to get all of the food that's coming down through the gut. But while it's doing that, it's taking away food from the organism that is eating it. So it's definitely hurting that other organism because it's not getting the food, and the tapeworm is getting all that food, and it's definitely benefiting because it's living. Another example would be ticks, fleas, and lice. They all eat different parts of the human or different parts of mammals, which can hurt them. And while the fleas, the ticks, and the lice, they all benefit. This is an example of parasitism. Okay, and our last part of this section here is going to talk about ecological succession, and this is basically just the predictable steps in which that occur in a community over time, and this is called ecological succession. And what's going to happen is basically you have a large disturbance. And what I mean by disturbance is basically something dramatic happens to the environment. So a brand new island can form, a big volcanic eruption. You can have a big flood, you can have a tsunami, a big earthquake. You have some kind of massive disturbance, and there's a massive disruption to that ecosystem. But what's going to happen is that ecosystem is going to end up recovering, and that ecosystem is going to end up changing over time. So our very first example is going to be primary succession. And primary succession is when you have a brand new land and you have no soil at all. So no soil exists and you have bare rock. This happens when you have a new island that maybe is created off of the coast of a certain place. It can also happen when you have a volcanic eruption on land and you're left with just hard rock. And the first species that are going to populate this area, they're called the pioneer species. And pioneer species, what they do is they basically make soil. They break down that rock and they make soil in primary succession. So let's take a look at an example. In our example here, we have bare rock, and there's a volcanic eruption here, and there's no soil whatsoever. Eventually what's going to happen is there's going to be some lichens that show up, and lichens are just a symbiotic relationship. It's a mutualistic relationship between an algae and a fungus, and what they do is they kind of eat away at the rocks. I believe a weak acid is produced, and it kind of breaks down those rocks, and when you break down rocks and you continue to break down rocks and you continue to break down rocks into smaller and smaller pieces, what is made is soil, and that's all soil is, just little tiny pieces of rock. So now these lichens are starting to break down that rock. And these are your pioneer species. Eventually, you're going to have enough soil, and your intermediate species are going to start to show up. These are going to be your grasses, these are going to be your flowers, your shrubs, stuff like that. Also, trees are starting to grow too, but they're very small and they grow very slowly. But the first few organisms you're going to start to see are going to be your grasses, and those grow very rapidly. So these are your intermediate species. And then those are going to end up growing, and then eventually your trees are going to start to get a little bigger. Your shrubs are going to start sprouting. They're all going to start to get a little bit bigger. You can see some fireweed down there, which is a type of flower right there. And then eventually, you're going to make it to your climax community. And your climax community is when all of these, I don't have a fifth slide right here, but it's when all of these trees end up getting very big. And what they do is they end up killing all of the different flowers and all the different shrubs that are below the trees, because the trees don't allow any light to come down. So we start over here on the left with our pioneer species, which are lichens, and then we have our intermediate species right here, shrubs, flowers, and then finally we have our climax community, And a climax community is when you're going to have just large trees that dominate the ecosystem. You see climax communities out at Fort Abercrombie in the big spruce forest, or any of the big spruce forests in Kodiak. In the understory, it's wide open because the climax community dominates it. Now that was primary succession. Primary succession happens right after a happens when there's no soil at all. However, secondary succession, and we have this very distracting JPEG on the right here. Secondary succession is components of an ecosystem can be changed by natural events, and these natural events can be fires, they can be earthquakes, tsunamis. It's where you already have soil, and there's a big disturbance that basically wipes out the land, and you're starting over from zero. And this is secondary succession. And if we were to compare the two, there we go. Primary succession is first time plants or animals are established. Examples would be new islands, volcanoes, or when glaciers too strip off all of the soil. Kodiak, the reason 10,000 years ago when the ice caps started to recede, we had a bare rock, and that's why it's called the rock. And underneath, and we have very, very little soil here. So all the soil that is created is created in the last 10,000 years, and we had primary succession happening here 10,000 years ago. Now, secondary succession is after a blowout, a big event, something happens, and the community that was already there gets wiped out, and it's going to be reestablished again. Examples would be fire, flood, or human disruption. So let's take a look at a case sample right here. Upper left-hand side, we have the beautiful Mount St. Helens, so on the west coast, and a beautiful place. And what happened was there's a large volcanic eruption, and you can see the volcanic eruption right there. This is after the eruption. And if you were to come and look at it right after the eruption, after everything started to kind of settle down, you see all of these dead trees, and it's like a barren landscape right there. This is an example of secondary succession that's going to happen here. You already have soil, and it was just a big blowout of ash. So you don't need the lichens to break it down and to make soil. There's already soil there. So what happened was is that eventually the grasses started to come back, and then after the grasses, and those are going to be your your intermediate species, and then after that, summer trees started to come back, and eventually these trees are going to dominate the landscape, and you are going to have a climax community. So red alder is one of the shrubs that actually disperses easily and capable of rapid growth in the nutrient-poor volcanic soil. So that's some of the intermediate species there. And then also a bunch of other birds and stuff like that too started to eventually come back. So I hope you enjoy that, and good luck on your tests and quizzes. Please watch some other YouTube videos on different symbiotic relationships also.